Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Can Atheists Know God? We're going to be covering the last video in this series, which is, Can Atheists Know of God's Goodness? So, in this series, we're examining the question of whether God could prove his properties even if he manifested himself before an atheist willing to do anything to convince that atheist that he was God. Imagine that you do not believe in God. One day, your friend Bob walks up to you and says he has a secret he wants to tell you. He's actually an omnipotent, omniscient, omnibenevolent God. Maybe the Christian God, maybe Allah, pick your favorite Abrahamic tradition. He's aware that you're a non-believer, and he really wants to save your soul. So he's willing to do anything in his power to prove to you that in fact he is all good, all powerful, and all knowing. Is there anything you can ask him that will prove these properties of God? This video is the most important, as if Bob can prove that he's all good and that being all good means he never lies, we could trust him when he told us that he was all powerful or all knowing. However, this is also going to be by far the hardest task for Bob. Take a moment to think. What would you ask Bob to do to prove that he is all good? You can pause the video if you want. Think of the question. If Bob appeared before you and said, I am God, I'll let you prove it, what would you ask him to do to prove his goodness? Now, the first challenge in this task is defining what someone means by all good. This comes in the form of the classic Euthyphro dilemma, which is either God is all good because everything he does happens to be good, i.e. goodness derives from somewhere else and God just follows those rules, or God is all good because what he does is simply defined as, what is good is simply defined as anything he does. Both will be very challenging to defend empirically. Let's take a look. It should be clear that the second claim cannot be proved empirically. A truth by definition, or an analytic truth, things that are true by definition, are not generally the kinds of things that can in any way be proved a posteriori with evidence in the world. If you said a bachelor is the definition of an unmarried man, you could not prove this by interviewing unmarried men. If Bob claimed that the definition of good changed with his will, if he enslaved someone, then suddenly slavery became moral, you would have no way empirically to test this claim. In other words, there's no empirical way to have a justified belief about God's actions being by definition good. You might think there's an ontological argument for this, but that's outside the scope of this argument, and those arguments have been disproven many times over. Check out my series on the ontological argument for more. But what about the other horn of the dilemma? If what we mean by all good is simply that everything God does is good, or the best possible thing to do, or perhaps that God is all of the good things, how could you determine if God has done and will do, everything God has done and will do is good or right? You could start by asking him to do a good deed, say, save a dying child who was hurt in an earthquake. However, this is going to run into a substantial theological issue. If God can save a dying child hurt in an earthquake, then this is not the best of all possible worlds, because there's a better world where God saved that child. And it raises the question of why God didn't prevent that child from being harmed in the first place. Surely earthquakes were not logically required to have free will, but we might follow Leibniz and say that this is the best of all possible worlds, and so God created the best of all possible worlds. So in this world, that child had to die from an earthquake. But if God saves the child, then we're no longer in the best of all possible worlds. Either God should have prevented the bad thing in the first place, or it is part of the best of all possible worlds, and he is making the world worse by doing that thing. If he makes the world worse, he's not good because he's doing something that's harmful. And if he could have prevented the bad thing in the first place, he's not all good because he wasn't doing the good thing in the first place. Either way, he cannot stop it without exposing the fact that he made a mistake in the first place by creating a world with less than the maximum possible good, or he exposes his evil by changing from the best of all possible worlds to a slightly worse world. Either way, God cannot act, or he is evil. Therefore, God can't do something good in front of you, or he betrays the fact that he's not actually all good. Even setting these concerns aside, doing one good deed does not make someone all good. If it did, many other people should be God as well. There seem to be plenty of people that seem to do good deeds all the time. To prove that God is all good, you would need to see all the things that he has done, as well as all the things that he will do. However, this will encounter the same problem as omnipotence. Someone that is evil and all-powerful could simply lie about what they have done, manipulate your perception or your mind to think they had done good, when in fact they had done evil. Further, there's no way to be justified in the belief that Bob will keep doing good. He might offer to show you the future, but once again, if he is evil, he could just lie about what's in the future or simulate it. Simply put, the only way to determine if Bob is all good is to rely on his testimony, and if he is evil, then his testimony is in doubt, and so you can't rely on his testimony. If Bob is all powerful, would be no way for you to know if he committed a genocide yesterday, nor would there be any action he could do that would prove he did not, even if he was in fact all good. There's no empirical proof God could provide you with to show that he will always be good and has always been good. The upshot of these arguments is quite powerful. If God appeared before an atheist, there is nothing he could do that would make the atheist's belief in his omnipotence, omniscience, or omnibenevolence justified. There's nothing that God himself could do to prove his properties. There's no way any other weaker empirical evidence, such as a holy book or a conversation about a prophet saying that he can do some particular miracle, or other a posteriori evidence could do so either, because those will all necessarily be weaker than God showing up in front of you and saying, I can do anything you want. Only an a priori ontological argument can prove God's properties to the non-believer, and all of these arguments are sorely wanting. So, fellow atheists, there is no reason to think that even if someone appeared to you who seemed to be able to do a great deal, know a great deal, and be very, very nice, you would be justified in thinking that they were God. You might be justified in believing in magic suddenly, or supercomputers that look like people. As a skeptic, I would be skeptical of those, but as an atheist that has a lower bar for justification, you might think that you were justified in doing those things. But there doesn't seem to be any empirical reason to think that such a person is God, even if they claim to be, or even if they are. Largely because you cannot prove that they are good and not lying to you, since the only thing you have to rely on is their testimony, which is the exact thing that is in doubt. A big thank you to Andrew Sullivan for supporting Carneades.org on Patreon since 2020. You too can support the channel and get access to exclusive Patreon posts for just $2 a month, less than the price of buying me a cup of coffee once a month. If you want to support public philosophy, please do consider donating on Patreon. What do you think? Is there a way that someone on the street could convince you that they were a complete saint, that they had always done the maximally good thing and would never do anything wrong? What would they have to do to convince you of that, and to make it so you had a justified belief that that was true? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe if you like this content and you want to see more. Hit that notification bell. And as always, watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.